Hello and welcome to History at Nightfall. Today, we're diving into episode 2 of Adolf Hitler's childhood. In this chapter, we'll explore the memories of his only childhood friend, August Kubizek, a rare glimpse into the early years of a boy who would one day change the course of history. Also, if you haven't watched episode 1 yet, you can find it right here on my channel. So sit back, relax, and join me as we uncover another piece of this dark and complex past. But before we begin, if you subscribe and leave a like, it may be a small action for you, but it truly makes a huge difference for this channel. Now, if you're ready, let's begin our story. When Adolf boarded that train for Vienna, I believed, perhaps naively, that he was embarking on an adventure shaped by talent and ambition. He was a boy overflowing with dreams, carrying little more than a portfolio of sketches and the certainty that greatness awaited him in the capital. But Vienna was not the city he imagined. In time, I learned that the journey he took was not a rising path, but a descent slow, painful, devastating. And the Vienna we both loved from afar soon revealed a different face. A city that could elevate young artists to brilliance or crush them without hesitation. This is the story of how Vienna transformed Adolf Hitler, not into the figure history would come to fear, but into a young man battered by disappointment, tested by poverty, forced to confront the gap between dream and reality. When Adolf first arrived, his letters were filled with excitement. He described Vienna with breathless admiration. The sweeping boulevards, the grand museums, the gilded facades of the Ringstrasse, the opera houses towering like temples dedicated to beauty. He insisted that every corner of the city felt alive with culture. He wrote of hours spent lingering outside art stores, studying plaster casts of classical sculptures, as though waiting to be invited into a world that already belonged to him in his imagination. But between the lines, I sensed something else. A tremor of uncertainty, a hint of intimidation. For the first time, Adolf was surrounded by people who shared his passions, his ambitions, his obsessions with art and architecture. In Linz, he had felt like a genius misunderstood. In Vienna, he was simply one among thousands. This realization unsettled him more than he admitted. Adolf's first goal in Vienna was clear: to gain admission to the Academy of Fine Arts. He believed the examiners would be dazzled by his talent, that they would recognize the precision of his architectural drawings and overlook his weaknesses in figure sketching. He wrote to me confidently, "I feel certain they will take me. I belong here." But Vienna, for all its beauty, was not a city that opened its doors easily. When the exam date arrived, Adolf dressed in his best clothes, simple, clean, carefully prepared by his mother months earlier. He carried his portfolio with almost ceremonial reverence. I later learned what happened inside the academy. The examiners reviewed his work. They praised his architectural lines sharp, controlled, imaginative. But they criticized his human figures, calling them stiff, lifeless, lacking the energy expected of a painter. When the rejection came, Adolf was devastated. But he did not describe it that way in his letters. He blamed the academy. He blamed the instructors. He blamed the process. He insisted he had been misunderstood. "It was not my talent that failed," he wrote, "but their inability to see what I can become." Even then, he shielded his pride with a sense of injustice. After the rejection, Adolf did not return to Linz as many expected. Instead, he chose to remain in Vienna, convinced he could still find a way forward. But Vienna was expensive, and money was scarce. His small inheritance, left from his father, dwindled quickly. He moved from one cheap lodging house to another, each more uncomfortable than the last. His days lacked structure. He wandered through museums for hours. He sat in cafes, nursing a single cup of coffee. He watched people in parks, commenting on their manners, their dress, their apparent lack of taste. He spent long afternoons sketching buildings he admired, yet he did not share many of those drawings with me. Perhaps he was ashamed. Perhaps he feared criticism. More likely, he was struggling with doubt that he rarely acknowledged aloud. The boy who once brimmed with certainty now felt the weight of failure, though he would never admit it openly. Despite his first rejection, Adolf planned to apply again the following year. He worked tirelessly on improving his portfolio. At least, that's what he claimed. But his letters revealed long stretches where he produced nothing at all. His energy was inconsistent. Some days he was consumed by determination. Others he fell into dark moods that left him paralyzed. When the second exam approached, Adolf seemed anxious, desperate even, but he maintained a mask of confidence. "That place belongs to me," he insisted. "They simply failed to understand my potential last time." But the second rejection was far more final. The academy not only refused to admit him, they advised him to consider a different career altogether. Architecture, perhaps, but not painting. This blow shook him deeply. For the first time, he admitted to me that he felt lost. "I do not know what to do," he wrote. "It is as though a door has closed, and I am left outside with no way in." It was a rare moment of vulnerability. But soon that vulnerability hardened into resentment. Vienna was not kind to the poor. As Adolf's funds ran out, he began selling his few possessions: a warm coat, some books, sketching materials, even sentimental items from his family. Eventually, he found himself in lodging houses for men of limited means, crowded, cold, and often unsafe. His letters became fewer. When he did write, the tone was strained, hurried, as though he did not want me to glimpse the full extent of his hardship. One letter simply read, "I am managing. Do not worry." But years later, when he spoke about this period, he described it as the lowest point of his life. He skipped meals. He slept in rooms crawling with vermin. He grew thin, pale, and increasingly bitter. Vienna, the city he had once worshipped, was slowly crushing him. I visited Vienna once during this time. The moment he opened the door of his small room, I realized the situation was far worse than he had described. The air inside was cold and damp. His bed was nothing more than a thin mattress atop wooden boards. His belongings were scattered, mostly old papers, unfinished drawings, worn-out clothes. Yet Adolf greeted me with forced enthusiasm. "I am simply going through a phase," he said. "It will pass." But I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. I could hear the hunger in his voice. He was no longer the energetic dreamer who had paced the streets of Linz, describing magnificent cities and daring architectural visions. He seemed defeated, but he also seemed angry. Anger became the force that kept him moving. Something fundamental changed in Adolf during his years of hardship. His bitterness grew sharper. He complained increasingly about groups of people he believed were responsible for Vienna's social and artistic decline. His judgments became more absolute, more categorical. He developed strong opinions about politics, society, and culture, opinions he had never expressed with such intensity in Linz. Some of these ideas were troubling even then. They reflected frustration, wounded pride, and a growing tendency to blame instead of reflect. He began to see the world in stark contrasts. Genius versus mediocrity, purity versus corruption, greatness versus decay. There was little room for nuance. To survive, Adolf began painting small watercolors, scenes of Vienna's landmarks, which he sold to tourists and small shops. It was humble work, far from what he imagined for himself, but it kept him alive. Sometimes he earned enough for a decent meal. Other times he barely earned a few coins. Yet he continued, driven not by passion but by necessity. His life became a cycle of struggle, painting cheap views of the city, selling them for whatever he could get, walking endlessly to stay warm, skipping meals to save money, sleeping in shelters when he could not afford a room. These experiences hardened him. They also isolated him further. Even years later, Adolf spoke of his mother with deep sorrow. Her death had left an emptiness inside him, and Vienna only magnified that loneliness. He had lost the one person who offered him unconditional love. Now he faced the world alone, with no support, no guidance, no sense of belonging. When he spoke of her, his voice softened in a way I rarely heard otherwise. He carried her memory like a fragile treasure. But grief also fueled his inner turmoil. It made him more susceptible to despair, more vulnerable to resentment. Vienna did not heal him, it deepened the wounds. There were months when Adolf nearly disappeared from my life. His letters stopped. No one in our neighborhood heard from him. Rumors reached me that he had fallen gravely ill, or that he had been forced into the poorest shelters. Years later, he confirmed that he had reached a breaking point. He described days spent lying in bed, too weak to rise, too hopeless to work. He felt abandoned by destiny, betrayed by the world. And yet, slowly, he began to rebuild himself. He continued painting. He sought out work where he could. He developed new routines, rigid, demanding routines that gave him a sense of control. It was during this rebuilding phase that his worldview solidified. His ideas grew sharper, more extreme, more unyielding. He believed he had suffered because the world was unjust, and that it was his purpose to challenge that injustice one day. Vienna had broken him, but it had also forged him. By 1909, Adolf was no longer the boy who left Linz with dreams of artistic glory. He had become someone harder, someone fiercer, someone burdened by anger and disappointment. And yet, I did not fully understand what had happened to him until much later, until World War I drew him into its chaos and transformed him even further. But before the war came another tragedy, one far more personal, far more devastating. A tragedy rooted not in poverty or rejection, but in the deepest human bond he had ever known.